Good evening. My name is Jennifer Bullock. I'm with BBR Creative. We're happy that you have joined us this evening for the 5th of 5 LCAG meetings, LCAG workshops. This is part 1. Part 2 will be in another week. As a reminder, if you are joining us by phone and by computer, we would ask that you mute the mic on one of those devices. If you are joining us by phone, I would request that you text the phone number in the chat, which is 337-781-6470. That'll give us a chance to change the name in the list of participants. And that number again is in the chat. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. Tomorrow, we will be putting up the recording, the agenda, and the PowerPoint presentation, the Lafayette Connector website. And as usual, we will email you to let you know when it is up. Again, if you are joining us by phone, please send a text message with your name and your affiliation to 337-781-6470, and we'll rename you in the list of participants. Looks like everybody else is renamed. I think so. All right. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. Joining me today from BBR are Madeline Tiller, Roderick Brownridge, Bree Hodges, and Sierra Gilbo. And we will be handling logistical issues. If you should have a problem, go ahead and put it in the chat, or you can also text that phone number that I put in the chat for you as well. Otherwise, we'll proceed as necessary. If you have questions for clarification purposes, if there's a particular question you might have about where something is, an alignment, just something for clarification, we'll take those questions and present them to someone to answer for you. Otherwise, we'll ask that you hold those questions, put them in the chat, and at the end of the presentation, we'll have somebody answer your questions for you. And with that, we'll get started. I'll turn it over to Steve Wallace. Stantec. Steve is the project manager for the Lafayette Connector Partners, and he will move things for us.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank all of y'all for being with us this afternoon. As Jennifer said, this is our 5th workshop, and we've got several things that we'd love to share with you guys, and have you go back and talk with your constituents about, and then really come back and have a more in-depth conversation next week at the same time, next Thursday. And so some of those topics are alternative lighting, and understructure concepts is another one we'll discuss today. We'll talk more about green infrastructure and landscaping. Some intersection treatments as well is another topic. And then street furniture is another one that we'll talk about as well. And so, again, thank you all for participating in this. Your input's very vital to us into this whole process. So we'll go through each segment, and different speakers will be talking about that. And then again, if we really want y'all to be able to go back and use the information that Jennifer said we'll be posting after this meeting, and get more input, clarification from the groups that you represent, and then have more of an in-depth and input conversation next Thursday as well. So with that, I think we'll start off with the alternative lighting, and Jeff, you can kick that off. This is showing the current status. Sorry, this slide right here. As you can see, we've worked through several things up to this point. We're down to the second to the last item, which is the urban design workshop here in October of 2021. Following this will be some neighborhood meetings, and then a public open house later on this fall, and more about that later on. So Jeff, you ready? You can take off.
I am indeed. Hello, everyone.
Hey.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Grobe. I'm a landscape architect with Stantec. And today, the topic is lighting, all different kinds of lighting. And next to the viaduct itself, this is probably one of the bigger areas that could have a substantial impact on the look and the urban design aspects of this project. So we want to spend some time talking about this and why it's important. And we're really going to need your help in understanding what everyone thinks about this, and you'll see why that becomes important in a few minutes. Next one, please. So there's going to be 5 areas that could have lighting. Obviously, the first one is up on the main line, or if the main line's that grade, but mostly there's main line, I-49, the roadway, and the ramps. Next, and then we're going to be lighting the new Evangeline Boulevard in the core area between, say, Johnston and the railroad spur, or 2nd and 3rd. Next, we're also going to have to consider, and there will be some possible need for understructure lighting if community uses are called for. Now, this comes into play. This only happens if then there's a decision made that you want to that there's going to be understructure uses that require lighting. You're not going to need it right off the bat, but if there's a use underneath there that's going to require lighting, then this would come into play. Next, we've talked a lot about decorative architectural lighting of the structure. One of the things that a signature structure allows itself is to be enhanced even further with a signature lighting scheme, and that can be done to further augment or highlight the context in which it sits. I mean, I've seen signature bridges that are used for all different kinds of purposes and lighting purposes throughout the year, different seasons, different ways of doing it. So it can be a real attraction for the community. And it's a decision that needs to be talked about today. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the decorative lighting of the structure is important. And finally, there's going to be something else that's going to need to get lit too. We don't know what it is yet, but there's probably going to be something else that's going to need to be lit. And we want to have that ability to do that as well. Next slide. So why is lighting important? Let's talk about this for a minute. Like I said, besides the viaduct itself, probably lighting has the single biggest impact on how this corridor will transform itself and how it will appear to all of Lafayette and visitors to Lafayette. So let's take a look at this. The biggest reason, of course, is safety. You want to light it because you want to be safe for vehicles, for pedestrians. You want to keep the neighborhood safe, and you want to have defensible space. Look at those 3 images along the bottom there. You can see why I purposely put that one there in the middle. That's not lit very well, and that's the reason why you want to have good lighting. You want to have good lighting so that everyone feels comfortable in the spaces that we're going to create in the evening. And it's also for vehicular safety and neighborhood safety as well. And you have what's called defensible space. Next. It creates place. Lighting and lighting standards and the equipment that you use create identity. It creates a context. And if you use equipment that is applicable to the community, it creates context. You have more inclusion. With the better lighting, you'll increase mobility and the accommodation of more people across the board. It's not just for cars. It's not just for able-bodied people, but it's for everybody. And this is very important. But it creates a sense of place. And this very well could be important to the stakeholders here at hand. Next, please. The quality of light. We're going to talk about the quality of light just a minute, but particularly if you can enhance your nighttime experience with true color rendering, you have a better quality of life. We all know, and I'm certainly glad that most places, including Louisiana, have gotten away from using high pressure sodium, which is awful. It's that yellow stuff, and it makes you look pretty sickly in the nighttime. Everybody's going now to LED. This project will use only LED for both energy purposes and for color rendering purposes and efficiency. But quality of life and color rendering are very important in the nighttime experience. Again, looking at those pictures down below. And then finally, we have some economics. We're going to have, if you have it well lit, you have more access and longer access and usage of any possible facilities that are there. For instance, if you've got an understructure use and it's well lit and everybody feels safe, you get a lot more use out of it than if it's not lit, or if it's poorly lit, nobody wants to go there. So you get longer access to your facilities and you get better usage out of it if it's lit properly. So this is why lighting is important, and this is why we're going to talk about it for a minute. Next slide, Dave. So we have, there's some planning here. Excuse me, please. Next. So we're saying, why is this important? Well, it's got to reflect the community's aesthetic and preferences. And this is going to be the crux of what we'll talk about in this section. The equipment that we're going to show are only options, but you're going to see the difference between doing nothing and doing something. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's important because the equipment, if you're trying to create a sense of place, and if you're trying to create an identity, particularly for a new urban boulevard, you want to have all components of that. And we talked about street furniture and other things too, but you want to have all the components of that talk to one another. They want to reflect the community's aesthetic and preferences. So at the end of all of this, we're going to ask you for your opinions on this and go talk amongst yourselves and see what other people think. But the point of all of this is to see if there's something here that can reflect that and then add to the experience that you're creating in a new urban corridor there for the Evangeline Boulevard. Next. It's got to certainly, it's important because you got to have ease of operations and maintenance. The Lafayette Utility System, LUS, operates and maintains all this stuff. And we've heard from them loud and clear that they need to have it as maintenance free as possible, as we all do. I just changed the light bulb in my kitchen and I didn't want to get on that chair, but I had to do it. And the same thing with all kinds of lighting throughout the city. It should be as worry free as possible, but nothing is for nothing. It's eventually going to have to change the bulb. Somebody's going to hit a pole. There is maintenance involved, but you want to have ease of operation and ease of maintenance, and it wants to be cost effective, and that's where the LED comes in as well. And finally, you're going to have, it should be compatible with the mainline structure architecture, which we spent a lot of time talking about, and some of the other urban design elements that we talked about in this project. There's a lot of thought going into what this whole thing's going to look. You have a chance, a once in a lifetime opportunity to create a whole thing, and all the bits and pieces should talk to one another. And there has to be holistic planning, and particularly with lighting and street furniture. And you've got this viaduct structure in place, that'll be in place here. All these things want to hold hands and they want to talk to one another such that it looks like it was thought across the board, and it all makes sense as a statement together. Next slide, please. So what are some possible scenarios and outcomes? Go ahead. Well, go ahead, Dan. Lighting would be installed with no alternative lighting selected. For instance, we're going to talk a little bit about what's the default here? And this is going to be the big question of the evening. If we don't have this discussion, and nobody, or the consensus is that there's no preference for anything that's alternative than the standard, then the standard will prevail. okay, because that's what standards for. If there's no alternative lighting selected, then the standards that LUS has, and I'll show you those in a minute, those would be the ones that are utilized on this project. LIDOTD, in conjunction with the local utility and the local municipality, is mostly only responsible for lighting the interstate. They don't light local streets. They don't light the state highway. It's all down to LUS. And they really take care of, they will energize, they will maintain, and they own the lighting throughout the streets. Now, LUS is a subsidiary, or it's a wholly owned division of the Lafayette Consolidated Government. So LUS is a wholly owned piece of the city government. So city government tells LUS what to do. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at what LUS is, their standard equipment. Okay, next. You've seen it, you know it, you love it. This is the old Cobra head. It's all over. All the pictures, by the way, are screenshots from, around town. And their picture on the right is from their standards. But you know this, it's an aluminum pole, and it's got a davit arm, and it's got a Cobra head type fixture. And that's it. That's a Cobra head. It's called the Cobra head, single Cobra head. You could have a double Cobra head. This is a double arm Cobra head. Same pole, just two arms and two lights. And this would be if you were going to light something down the middle of a median. We've talked about that, but we think that the new boulevard would probably be lit from the edges, not down the middle, because the median's pretty wide. And you want to get that luminaire out over the travel lane so you get good light distribution and photometrics on the ground plane. Next. They do have decorative lighting in their catalog, LUS does. They have this thing, this acorn. This one is on Jefferson Street, and it's a decorative equipment. It's in their catalog. They stock it today. They use it today, and it's an option. And then finally, they have the same kind of acorn fixture next as a double, if you wanted to do them. Okay, so that's what LUS has today. That's what would be implemented if no other decisions or requests were made to do something else. And it's very important to understand, because we need to hear from you next week, after you've talked about this. We need to hear from you if you think that this is going to be something that you might ask the city, or you would suggest that, this is kind of worth it to us to create a different kind of a sense of place, and it's going to cost money. But it'd be something where you could use alternative lighting fixtures. And we'll go through just a quick sampling of a million of these things that are possible. Next slide. So let's talk about what are some alternative options that might work. There's a plethora of alternative lighting fixtures out there. Let's just go through a sampling, and please understand, by no means these are not the only ones that are available. Keeping in the back of your mind, you got the LUS standard stuff over here, and then you got the potential for doing something else. Next slide. Okay, so we'll first start with talking about lighting the main line. And the bridge architects have found this setup, this pole and this arm and luminaire, which would be compatible with the main line structure. It's a little bit more modern than the Cobra head, and it certainly could work. This one happens to have a pedestrian fixture off the back of the pole. For some reason, we wouldn't do that on the main line, but I want you to notice that it's more about the aesthetic. We're going to assume that all these poles and all these luminaires have all the right optics, have all the right photometrics, can pass all the technical stuff, but we want to make the point that this is more about the look of the lighting, assuming all things technical are equal. So for the main line, this is one possibility, one suggestion that's been made to light the viaduct up on top, the roadway portion of the viaduct. Next. if we're going to get down on the ground, especially in the boulevard section, there's some various options for lighting the boulevard. Next slide, please. Here's one that's pretty nice. Is we heard during a lot of the other meetings that there's there's a trend towards somewhat traditional, but there's a trend towards being modern, and it kind of goes back and forth. And so we found this one here that kind of splits the difference a little bit. It's a little bit country, it's a little bit rock and roll. It's got a kind of a traditional pole, but it's got a nice graceful upsweep in the arm. And the pendant fixture is a little traditional, but then the pedestrian optional pedestrian fixtures off the mid part of the pole are a little bit more modern looking. And so this sort of splits the difference between the two, and this you could use to light the boulevard. Okay. It's from a national manufacturer. It's been used all over the country. Very, very popular fixture. Next. Here's one that we thought might get your attention. If you really wanted to create a special look for that boulevard, let's go all out and get something that is really different. You haven't seen this probably before, but I offer it to you for your consideration. This, if you use this flanking both sides of the boulevard on the edges, would create quite a dramatic statement as you're traveling north or south from either 2nd and 3rd Street down to downtown, or you're coming up from Johnson Street. You get a line of these going, you'll notice it, and if it's the right aesthetic and if it's the right look for everything else that's going to be suggested, that this might fit in as well. Again, this one also can light both roadways and pedestrian spaces with a lower fixture off the back of the pole. Next, please. Here again is another more modern looking fixture. It's on a straight pole, but we looked at this one and we thought that this would be sort of, it's not the curved pole, it's not the one with the pendant arm and stuff. It's sort of a cross between the two. And again, it has a newer kind of a look. We wanted to be able to offer you things that are out there that are modern, but still are quite viable and would work in the context that we're going to ask it to work. So that's another option for lighting the boulevard. Now, let's go on to some other lighting areas that we're going to need to talk about. There's going to be at some point if there ever becomes an agreement for joint use development underneath the structure for various community uses, some of those uses might require lighting for safety or extension of use time and stuff. So move on. From the bridge architects, again, they've suggested this family of fixtures. Now, you see the first one, the Astral Slim, is for aerial lighting of the space below the structure. The middle one, the Flexia Top, is for highlighting specifically if there is medallions or artwork on the piers, which we've talked about, and it's going to be included in some of the areas. And finally, if there is a pathway through here or there's a place for more pedestrian lighting, they've suggested that the fixture on the bottom there, which got cut off for some reason, would be a good one for lighting pathways. And I agree with that this is a nice family of fixtures that would be very compatible if you were going to light community use areas. But that's only going to happen if there's an agreement in place for someone to fund it, to operate it, to maintain it, and to make sure that it doesn't go bad. So all of that has to happen first before any of this happens. But you have to design, build, operate, and maintain as a partnership with multiple entities before this stuff happens. And this is going to be the topic of the next section of today's discussion. Next, please. So Then we also have, we're going to be possibly lighting the signature structure, next please, the signature structure itself. We've seen all kinds of stuff being done for highlighting signature structures, viaducts, decorative long span bridges and stuff. And this is limitless. You can have a lighting design, a lighting program that can follow the seasons, can announce, special events. You can spell out your name, I suppose, if you want it or something. But the point of it is, if you have a signature structure, you're kind of not going all the way out unless you can utilize that signature structure by highlighting it with architectural lighting. This is something that the DOTD does not do, as a matter of course, and it would be something that would be would have to come from the city and others to say, this is worth it to us. We think that this is necessary. We think that, thank you for the big bridge, and we're going to pay to light it up so that it really shines. So again, the potential is there, but it has to be something that you all think is important enough to go ahead and dedicate some time, effort, and money to make it happen. Next, please. And then finally, we don't know. I mean, we're still in the planning purposes. There's going to be something else somewhere that's going to need some lighting. And I just offer this next slide as 3 examples. Who knows what it is? There could be a piece of sculpture in the middle of a field or of an infield, or let's say it's not on a road, and say it's not under the bridge, and say it's not on the main line, but you still need to light something. It's got to get lit, but it's going to have to be done again through one of those joint use development agreements. Who's going to design it? Who's going to install it? Who's going to take care of it? And who's going to fund it? So, again, but that would mean that those agreements are in place before any of this happens. But there's that potential for that to happen if everyone deems this important enough. And that's going to be the big question that we have next. So let's go to the last one, Derek, and see what we got here. So what do we need from LCAG? This is the big question. And I was going to say it's the $1 million question, and it kind of is. This is going to be something that everyone's going to have to think about and prioritize and look to yourself and talk to your constituents and see what do we think is necessary, what do we think is important to us, where would we like to ask for some money to be spent, is there money to be spent, these are the kinds of things. So we start off here. The standard lighting that we showed you earlier, the LUS standards, that's what it's going to be unless additional local funds are committed for alternative fixtures. Now we've asked, go back. We asked LUS, we said, is it okay if we offer, or can you guys entertain other stuff? They go, yeah, we could do it. They're not categorically opposed to it, but they said, it has to be, under certain parameters. So, okay, well, there's funding and there's, how does it work and all that stuff. It has to work technically, it has to do all that. But they said, we're not flat out against it. We just need to have it work for us as well, because we're the people that are going to get stuck with it. Okay, so go to the next thing. So what are the 2 questions? Okay, so the first question is enhanced lighting preferred for a distinctive look and a sense of place along the corridor? That's probably the question of the hour here. We're asking you, do you think that implementing an alternative lighting strategy is something that is worth the money that you might have to spend? And how much that is, we're still working on that. It's not nothing, but it's not $1 zillion either. But the point is, you first want to decide in your mind, is this something that is even worth it? Because if you say, nah, that's stupid, just use the standard stuff, then we're done. the discussion's over. But if you think that using some other kind of lighting strategy and doing it up a little bit different will make a difference to the corridor and to Lafayette, then you want to consider this. Next. And is that additional cost, this is part of the same question, above the standard, a worthwhile expenditure of city funds? And that's something that I can't answer. That's something that you have to talk amongst yourselves, and then, I guess go to the city or petition the city or talk to somebody and say, look, we think this is important because of reasons A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z. Here you get a once in a lifetime opportunity to create a holistic and cohesive urban boulevard corridor, and all the pieces have to talk to one another. So the lighting is particularly important in that, and we need to consider it a very important aspect of it. I think I'm done. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you very much. Let's go on to Scott and not Scott, Josh, and some understructure uses. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that. Derek, you want to jump to the next slide? One of the things that we wanted to, start a discussion on is just thinking about the understructure uses and starting to show some drawings that just start to look at objects and uses and from a sense of scale and just to start discussion purposes. And so along this, we kind of identified these 4 areas that we'll kind of do an enlargement of and have some discussion about. Some of them focusing on the boulevard, and then the other 2 more associated with the Willow interchange on the south and north side. So, Derek, next slide, please.
Hey, Josh, real quick.
Yeah.
Jeff, we have a question from Sam who wants to know, are the lighting standards set by LUS or DOTD? You can just answer them real quickly, and then we'll let Josh get back to his presentation.
Say the question again. I'm sorry.
Samuel asks, are the lighting standards set by LUS or DOTD?
LUS, but they're compatible and with what DOT would use. They're really one and the same.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt, Josh. Go ahead.
No problem. No problem at all. So, well, again, this just to state again, this really isn't for a final design direction. These are just kind of discussion diagrams and drawings just to start to show how objects and how ideas can start to fit under structure. So taking the roundabout concept and seeing how that starts to relate to some of the existing buildings, the residences that will remain, and then looking at some opportunities for redevelopment. And that's kind of illustrated in the purple. And it's not that all of these would be redeveloped. We just wanted to start to think about that there are areas that do have potential and where might those occur. And then under structure, we started to really basic ground plane, thinking about how the multi-use trail would move through the space, how it would start to engage at intersections, how bikes, pedestrians would move across those and through, and then thinking about how we could start to reinforce that with some berming, some simple weaving of plants and aggregate, thinking about opportunities for stormwater capture and slowly releasing that, and just start to see how all those things could kind of come together to create this really kind of visual aesthetic along that. And as people are moving along the space and passing through either by vehicular or moving along the trail, it's kind of this general aesthetic that kind of ties this whole area together. So the next slide, Derek, will start to think about, well, what's the next layer on top of that? So starting to think about, well, can the understructure be utilized for some parking to help to support these redevelopment areas? So can we free up some of that space that would be associated with parking and utilize the structure to have this covered parking right adjacent to those areas. I'm also thinking about some amenity zones. You know, is there a potential for a farmer's market? You can kind of see that in one of the areas. Derek, if you want to highlight that. And it's not that we're saying that this is exactly where we think the farmer's market would go. It's more the idea of this is how a farmer's market type setting could occur and could be placed under structure, whether it's this block or it's the block down. That's part of, again, that joint use development, and that's for discussion at a later time. This is more thinking about, do some of these fit? Are these good things to move forward? Again,
Josh?
thinking of, yeah.
Oh, sorry. We have
Yeah.
a question from Matthew. I'm going to let you
Sure.
answer it. And I didn't realize that Samuel had a follow-up question. So once you've answered Matthew's question, I will unmute him in case he has any follow-up questions. Then we'll go back to Samuel and I will unmute him. But
Absolutely.
Matthew asks, will there be signaled crossings at every point where the multi-use trail crosses the intersection? Will there be signaled crossings at every point where the multi-use trail crosses the intersection?
I think that that's something to be determined, and it depends on where the crossing occurs and how it's relating to some of the other vehicular traffic in the area. In this example, with that roundabout right in the middle, we're bringing that multi-trail down and having it utilize some of the crossing associated with the roundabout. So in that case, no, there wouldn't be what traditionally being called like a hawk signal or something like that. As you keep on moving along that trail, Derek, and you move, you can see there's another crossing point in the other direction where it would cross. And, you know, just maybe if Joe's on the line or one of the traffic may be able to answer that with a little more certainty, but it's something that we really haven't dug in too deep on the necessity for that at this moment.
Matthew, do you have a follow-up question for Josh?
I do have a follow-up. It's mostly related to the roundabouts. Has there been a decision made on whether or not we're going to go with the roundabouts for the Evangeline Boulevard, or we're going to do the signalized version of it?
Steve, you want to answer that, or?
Yeah, no, there has not. They're both still viable options that we're moving forward with. And so, yeah, more will be shown on both of those as we move along. But just to remind everybody, tonight, we're trying to focus in on the CSS elements that are along the corridor and the different topics. So if we could kind of keep our focus and questions on that, I think it would help move everything along. So
yeah, I understand that. And I just like, you know, it kind of relates to whether we're going to have signals or not on this multi-use path. And I mean, I don't know if you guys saw in the news, we had a cyclist that died on the thruway. There have been a large number of pedestrian and cyclist deaths on the thruway over the past year. And so my concern as a citizen, as someone who lives in this area, is whether or not we're taking pedestrian and bicycle safety seriously with this project and at every step of the way. So are we considering whether or not we should do signals for this multi-use path? Are we considering whether or not we should use hawk signals at for the pedestrian crosswalks at roundabouts? And I think that we should really emphasize that as a priority for this project. I think it's something that's important to the community of people that live in this area, these urban neighborhoods that this project will be passing through. And so I just want to make sure that my voice is heard on that, because I feel like, you know, there has been a bit of discussion on it, but it seems like cost might be a factor, and I want to make sure that it's high on the list of priorities.
Got it. No, thanks for the input. Appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you,
Matthew.
So I'd like to go back. I'd like to unmute Samuel now, because he did have a follow-up question for Jeff about the lighting standards. So Samuel, if you wanted to make that follow-up question for Jeff.
Sure, thank you. So my question was about whether it was an LUS standard or a state standard, and you responded saying it was an LUS standard, which was compliant with the state standards. So I understand that.
Yes.
But then I'm curious about, so if LUS sets a different standard for this project, wouldn't the project just have to comply with it, rather than it being that the city says it wants a higher standard that it then has to self-fund? I'm just very, kind of confused about that, because it seems like it's a local standard that this project has to meet, regardless of what that standard might be, as long as it's in compliance. So could you clarify that a little bit?
I'll try. I think I understand the question. LUS has their standards, but they're willing to implement other types of equipment upon request. And so does it become a new standard? Well, it might for the Evangeline Boulevard, but it wouldn't become a standard anywhere else in town. And it also has to come with the appropriate funding as directed by the LCG. Does that answer it? It's kind of a one-off, one-time, very site-specific application of something that they don't normally do, but they could do, all other things being equal, technically, et cetera. And it has commensurate dedicated funding.
Sure, I think I understand that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question, Samuel. Okay, Josh, if you want to go ahead and proceed.
Sure. I think, Derek, we can move up to the north on the next slide. So this just shows the continuation of that, again, looking at areas where we see potential for some possible development. And then again, how that weaving through of that trail, understanding that there's some opportunities by those asterisks for these identity elements to potentially happen and occur. And Jeff kind of alluded to that from the lighting of these specialty objects and how those could start to create gateway identifiable markers throughout the corridor or in the corridor. And then the next slide starts to look at potential for popping in of some support elements, whether it be parking or some other uses that really start to facilitate the development in those areas, thinking that they could be a little small, but utilizing some possibility of some understructure support for those development parcels. And then continuing to the north and to Willow, we start to look at how it would occur on the next slide. And this one we took this is where that visitor center, and we just took an approach. And again, this really isn't a direction. This is just kind of a what if the visitor center were to stay in this location? Could it be facilitated, and could it still be operated in a reasonable way? And so looking from the left of the screen to the right, bringing the trail across that, having a larger kind of detention area where we're starting to look at some stormwater. We heard basketball courts were a identifiable use and a desired use. So we wanted to be sure and show how those could kind of fit in and become part of the landscape and kind of be placed between these berms, having adjacent parking to that. And so in this example, we really start to take the visitor center and push it out on the corner so it has some visibility on that intersection. And then this long kind of processional arrival drive. So as you would come off of the drive there and into that drive, it starts to break, and you start to utilize some of the walls for the ramps of the above structure to create these mural walls. So as you're coming in, there's a mural wall that rises on one side, and then you're kind of swung around and there's a mural wall. So it's this real kind of introductional arrival sequence into the visitor center. Then we located some parking and then really utilize some of that existing water feature in those islands to create this walk that really is this approach and starts to introduce some of the history and the flavor and culture of the area as you approach the visitor center. So again, this is just kind of a what if scenario. This isn't a direction. This is just something that we wanted to scratch out on some paper and show just how for scale how this would fit, and just to get people's thoughts and feelings on and just start the discussion. The trail, you can kind of see how that kind of splits on either side and kind of encompasses that, brings people to the intersections on the corner as you're moving to the north onto the right side, and then makes its way across into the other space. So the next slide will be the continuation of that. And this is to the north of that. We looked at a couple different options and ways that we could provide some accessibility to this space. And it was really difficult. So we really wanted to use this as more of a landscape statement in this area, really amp up some of the ideas of planting and aggregate, and those ideas of stormwater collection. And it can be this kind of landscape statement that starts as you're coming down off of the interstate. It starts to set up that area for what's perceived as the visitor center on the other side. So again, just kind of just starting to spatially think about how things would fit, how people would move through the space. Thinking about where are our crossing points, and where does it make sense to start to mitigate and alleviate and provide those view angles as well. Derek, did I miss anything on that, or?
I think you're muted, Derek.
All right, I couldn't unmute myself. No, I think you covered it really well, Josh. A lot of concepts in there, most of which derived from the neighborhood meetings that we had up there, where we had some very engaged folks. And they did emphasize the natural area up here, that there weren't many natural areas that they could easily visit. And due to some lack of vehicular access and some other issues that lend itself to that, and did a fine job. Good, well covered.
Looks like Matthew has a question. So I'll bring that up. Will all
Yeah,
these?
Matthew asks, oh, go
Yeah.
ahead, Matthew. I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead, Jennifer.
No, I was just going to read your question. Will all of these understructure aspects be funded by the project budget?
Derek, you might be able to speak to that
I
a
was
little.
gonna see what you were gonna say there, Josh, but I'll try to help you out. It's not really absolutely defined yet. So as we discussed before, FHWA, that really is holding the purse strings as much as DOTD is, will fund elements that are serving a transportation function that typically will cover some modicum of landscaping and would cover something like an understructure trail. But there's an upper limit to that amount of landscaping. That's not defined in policy or code. It's just worked out over time. They would not fund something like a visitor center. The placement of the visitor center, well, actually there's a caveat on that too, because the project will displace the visitor center. So there's a real estate relocation function there that maybe I'm glossing over. To pick a better example, the basketball courts down there. FHWA is not in the business of building basketball courts. What I have seen in my experience is that the state and the federal agencies together would leave a suitable spot for such, grade it out, potentially serve it with the necessary utilities, and stop there, focusing on the transportation functions, with the other things being funded by any combination of local government, regional government, downtown economic development type of entities, et cetera.
I think there was a like a parking lot next to the basketball courts. Would that be considered a transportation purpose that FHWA would approve funding for?
It is possible. We like the idea of folks being able to come into the Willow area and then experience the entire corridor by foot or by bike. It'd be great if there were a bike share station right up at Willow and stations down throughout the corridor and downtown as well, so someone could connect that way. If part of that parking served that sort of purpose, then potentially so. If it was essentially wholly to support the basketball courts, probably not. But I see that Noelle has her hand up and she knows twice as much about all this as I do. So
We're going to go ahead and unmute Noelle here.
No, I just wanted to clarify, Derek, if that visitor center is there by a joint use agreement, it's not the same thing as a relocation.
thank you.
And that, if you can have joint use agreements, but when we need to use our right of way, the people who have the joint use agreement, it's in the agreement, they have to get out of the right of way.
So I hope that provides the basics of the answer, the details of which are, will be resolved and as the project moves forward and the design is advanced, to the point that we're talking about costs with FHWA. It's a bit early for that.
I think that was the last slide on these, Derek.
I'm sorry, that's the same one, right?
Yep, that's the same one. So yeah, if there's any other questions or on this, or we could move on to the green infrastructure if there's not.
Sounds like we should move on. It's very closely
Yeah, let's go ahead
related.
and move on.
So one of the features that you see under there is stormwater retention. A lot of folks are familiar with stormwater retention associated with highway projects. You see it in retention or detention ponds in many cases. In some cases, it's underground in large conveyance structures. So what we're going to talk about now is some conceptual ideas, CSS applications of different approaches to drainage. This is a very early part of the conversation, but we know that many of the stakeholders there are eager to have it. So we want to put some materials before you and get your comments on them. We've been having additional conversations. Gary Heitman, who's on the call, is leading the drainage analysis. He has been having some conversations with DOTD about their drainage procedures, the hydraulics manual, and how that incorporates or can consider some of these techniques. So the basic goals would be to support stormwater management, which we know is a significant need in the community, to supplement traditional conventional gray methods with nature-based solutions, which can have numerous different benefits, co-benefits I'll speak to. One of those being volume retention, right? Holding that first flush of rain. As you all know, a very, very large amount of rain can be managed by municipal systems and the Vermilion River if it's spread out across a long duration, right? So 10 inches of rain over many, many days can be managed. 3 inches of rain that falls within an hour is very difficult to manage. And so part of the concept is holding a portion of that, which would then be more slowly released as the system and or the river catches up. Many people have encouraged us to focus on native plants. That's been part of our methodology to date. I'll speak to that in a moment. That would also influence the approach to landscaping, which goes well beyond the green infrastructure and will be touched on as part of these slides. We need to continue to think about maintenance needs. Some of these facilities are more demanding than others. Some of them just have different demands, right? It's not necessarily easy to open up vaults and clean out inlets and such. There's a cost there, there's a cost with these, but being conscious of that and being conscious of the constrained resources of the local community and DOTD's vegetation management protocols is part of this. And then we talked about the quantity of stormwater. That's that first flush, that's holding a little bit of water, not much of which would be held in a small swale like this one. But there's another component to that, which is the water quality improvements, that as it infiltrates through the ground, through the mulches, is held by the plant roots, you're going to be able to remove certain pollutants before it reaches the river, including the known pollutants associated with roadway use and construction, the heavy metals that come off of brake pads and things of that nature, as well as just nitrogen loads from surrounding residential and other properties on one side. So we'll speak to that a little bit in brief. So those are the overall goals of the program. We've only begun the analysis really, but as you can imagine, it's not just an aesthetics-based approach. Our team is taking a very analytical approach to this. We'll be looking at soil conditions, flooding patterns, and using all these robust resources that have been developed, locally developed. The Native Plant Project, DOTD has roadside station management guidelines and extensive work on exactly how they like to have hydraulics and hydrology thought through. So those are all inputs in addition to what you're going to tell us in a week from now after reflecting on these issues. So I'll just tee it up with a bit of a show and tell here. Case study might be an overstatement. So this is a Pennsylvania DOT project where they were entertaining green infrastructure. And it started much like a meeting tonight where you're seeing conceptual drawings and just some loose talk about green infrastructure. It progressed from that to a level of preliminary engineering that was starting to detail the capacity and functions of each of these facilities, specifically outlining their locations, their capacities, and putting this together in a collective strategy, right, analytically. Then, of course, there is an aesthetic element to how that is laid out. You heard Josh talk about sweeps of vegetation and stuff, and you see some similar lines flowing through this work, which includes sweeps of different aggregate nature, plantings, some topographic relief. And for this PennDOT project, we use a tiny bit of a synthetic turf too, which I know is blasphemous to some folks, but does help solve a problem under the structure in certain locations of low light and for certain play spaces as well. So it went through preliminary engineering. And just to sort of prove up that this is possible, it's been built. Not all of it's been built, but a lot of it has. It is functioning and it is being monitored. So PennDOT has instrumentation put in so that they're tracking the water quality of the water coming in, as well as the water quality of the water going out. This is a typical practice if you can get some university involvement, especially, or get a grant. It's not a typical DOTD function. I also want to point out in these images just that what you're seeing here is the surface treatment. It's the aesthetic element and the way that people interface with it. As you can see, this young woman and her dogs sort of interfacing with the edge of it. But underneath here, there's a lot more work being done. There are large concrete vaults that are serving both a storage and a conveyance purpose. And they're also looking at many, many feet of specifically selected soil types that have void space to hold water and have certain water quality benefits as the water percolates through those and is cleaned to some extent and then enters the aquifer below. So what would we do here? Well, like I said, it's green and gray working together. There's still going to be traditional, conventional approaches to this that would likely be manifest in the final solution. The underground and surface working together, it's not likely that we would have enough surface retention to significantly manage a good storm event. And then what sort of features, right? So large rain-ish garden type things, right? The likes of which you saw, large areas that to many just look vegetated, but there's some complex thinking going on underground. And then the surface just gives you a great opportunity for some plantings, beautification that comes there with. You get some nesting, you get some butterflies and some other co-benefits that can be very, very delightful. Obviously, you can tell by looking at this, this is a more cost-intensive treatment than putting grass down, right? So maintenance goes up, initial capital cost goes up. So we're not talking about 3.5 miles of these. We're talking more about specific nodes where it would be important to do something special. Then there's smaller urban treatments, small swales. These also serve a great quality function. They serve a lesser quantity management function, but they're just great for beautification. In this case, it's also separating ped and vehicular movements. And then so those are sort of primary focus treatments or features, LID features, some folks will refer to these as. I think some of the local materials call them LID features, low impact development features. So there's two other options, which are sort of second tier. One is just street trees themselves, right? Trees are very important. Vegetation holds water and absorbs water. You know, a tree of that size could be holding 20 to 30 gallons of water, right? And so a significant rain event after a dry period, there is some capacity there, and there's obviously lots of other benefits. And then we could talk about some pervious pavement as well. We would not want to entertain that in any place that it would become an experiment or an operational challenge, any place with lots of volume, turning wheels, right? So even in a parking area, the turning of the front wheels can really torque the pavement and or the pavers. So maybe that's going to be a selective use in a small plaza or stretch of sidewalk, not likely something to be widespread in application, but an option. So we'll hear from y'all about your preferences for such, and perhaps that balance of options would change. So again, the ponds and pervious pavement, those are pretty well understood. I want to show you a little bit more detail about the more urban side of the treatment. These are the things that people would certainly experience, even when they don't intend to go see something natural. They've just gone to get a cup of coffee on the thruway or the new boulevard. So one of these is Swales. You recall these being depicted in these axonometric views of the streetscape. And essentially is a vegetated a rectilinear space, could be curved space. So what you have there is some specifically engineered soils that are going to have a retention ability, have a cleaning ability. You select different plantings and different soils based on what pollutants you're trying to deal with. Further into the process, we'd be looking very seriously at the TMDLs and the vermilion. We know suspended solids and some others are a primary concern, and there's specific treatments for those specific plants even. All of these would have some sort of overflow function as well, so that as this fills with water in a severe event, it's going to be able to overflow and discharge into the other system, so it wouldn't just spill out on the sidewalk. Similar to that, if we went with the sort of streetscape that had a tree well, you can do a pretty conventional tree well, but it's also becoming more commonplace now to do something that has an infiltration function to it with an overflow, so that you actually get a little bit more storage here, and it can be really good for the tree. So those are two urban treatments. We just wanted to show that there's things underground going on here. That's really where the work is being done water quality wise. So I don't want you to read any of this, it gets too complicated, but this is just to say that we sifted through lots of materials about landscaping there, right? And so 5 or 6 different resources went into it. LSU has some great stuff. The university has some materials, LCP has materials, etc. So the basic big 3 tiers were, we looked at everything that were on the native plant list for Lafayette. We looked at what in that subset was actually on the recommended street and municipal use plant list for LCP, and looked at what was also on the already approved DOTD list. So without asking for any special permissions, we got to some of these blue highlighted species, which I'm going to show for you now. So consider these, talk to folks about them. People do think about what trees they like and such. So we'd like to hear back from y'all. This is obviously not the exhaustive list. This is just some ideas. And at this point in the design, we're not going down to showing shrubbery or herbaceous species that would be used, just the big items which can have such a character defining a role to play. So among these trees, you have a lot of very large options, but not all of them are very large, suitable for open space, suitable for some of the stormwater areas, for where ramps are coming down and you have these leftover polygons or corners. We've got a little bit more space. Like I said, these are all selected because they're on all the right lists. No special permissions really required. They're native. and they're manageable in a variety of ways. So we've got a number of landscape architects on the team. I'm not one of them, but I know a little bit about trees. Others know a lot more, and we'll make sure to scrub this and all the other plant lists to make sure that we're not introducing something that's going to drop a lot of litter onto a sidewalk, would be weak. You know, we will be talking about the water oak. It's a little bit weak sometimes and can break in a high wind situation. We wouldn't want thorns near people, you know, the simple concepts like that we will take into consideration. But please think about these. The slides will come to you tomorrow, and you'll be able to talk to folks about whether they do or do not like the magnolia, right? Then for street trees, we have some repeating and some new ones, and a cultivar that I'd like to introduce and get your opinion on that as well. Kelly, who's one of our great landscape architects, really suggested that these might fill in nicely to the palette here. This is actually a newer cultivar, so it is not a native, but it is very similar to a lot of natives. So that is not bolded, so you can think about that. So these are possible street trees in different places, right? Some are more upright than others. And we would select those based on some cost and lots of other data. Now these and the previous, that's just one approach to the landscaping and the trees specifically. There's lots of other ways we go about this. Some people love palm trees. Some people love crepe myrtles. This is just one concept. Please consider it. Please consider the rest of the GI sort of options that we presented. If you have clarifying questions, we might have some time for them today, but if you just want to voice your vote, we can wait for next week for that.
Andy, you have your hand up. Do you have a clarifying question?
Yeah, but it actually dealt with, it can wait till next week. I was just trying to stay away from things like water oaks and cypress trees because of the issues they present. In that the water oak has no real root system. They do present major issues in high wind when during hurricanes and soft ground. And cypress trees, unfortunately, seek water. They'll get sewer systems, lines. They put up cypress knees. They break through slabs. They're terrible trees in that regard. So I would stay from anything like that that would either, you know, not work well in high wind or have a tendency to seek out water, such as the cypress tree. As beautiful as they are, they're better in open space and away from concrete areas that they can cause a lot of damage. Just ask the downtown area how bad it can be over there with the cypress trees they have that they planted. Live oaks are fine, but you make sure you have to have some sort of a barrier. In my experience in the construction industry, I've found that if you actually take and put a perimeter barrier of, just believe it or not, a number 6 bare copper wire around the tree, however far you want to bury it out, it actually stops the roots from growing out past that. That copper, for whatever reason, as it leaches into the ground, which it does forever, keeps those roots from expanding into the concrete areas. So those are things that they'll just go deeper rather than out. Those are things to consider. But I would stay with the more decorative trees, even if they have a tendency to lose leaves. They're all going to lose leaves. But I would definitely stay away from the water oaks and the cypress trees. Thank you.
Thanks.
Very helpful, Andy. And, you know, today, even earlier today, I was thinking about just taking the water oak out. You know, I had just swept through here in New Orleans, and there's a lot of limbs down, and water oaks, like normal, didn't fare so well. I think we're going back to Josh now.
So intersections, we wanted to have a brief discussion about a potential, you know, some options for that. So the next slide kind of starts to get into that. The image on the left is from the preferencing, and so we wanted to pull that forward. This was an image that was identified as a positive. And so we wanted just to bring that back to the forefront and talk a little bit about you know, crosswalks in particular. And so the options on the right kind of start to illustrate that with your kind of traditional painted crosswalk, or more of a stamped concrete decorative approach to the crossing, and then how a bike lane would start to become articulated and become a piece of that language of the circulation as it's moving along the street. So the next slide starts to show that visually at street level in a perspective, being more of this would be your traditional painted crossing. And so think this was on the Evangeline Boulevard, just a standard intersection not at a roundabout or not at a major crossing, but just showing how that painted crossing would occur. And then the next slide shows how that bike lane would start to get articulated and start to kind of become part of that language of the street. So the option to that would be, instead of the traditional painted crossing, to have a stamped concrete. Color is up for, is not really a specific point. It could be gray, it could be red. There's a lot of options of that, but it's talking about more of it being a decorative feature in that crossing. And then the next slide starts to show how that would occur with the bike lane starting to come in that. And this is, again, just bringing up these graphics just for discussion. If that's something that we want to move forward, this idea of this stamped concrete as an option, or if just the idea of just that painted crosswalk is preferred.
Hey, Josh?
Yeah, Jeff, go ahead.
I want to reiterate what I said earlier. A lot of the things that we're showing today, you have what's standard that'll go in if nobody has a preference, or this is where you get a chance to express your opinion on whether you think that this is something that you might want to find some extra funds for to pay that additional cost. Here's another component of a comprehensive boulevard urban design palette of materials that may go in concert with some of the other things that we've shown you. And you can have none of them, all of them, but it's all money that needs to be found, and it needs to be purposed, and you have to have a good reason and purpose to do so if it is a priority to the community. And I'll say no more.
Thanks, Jeff.
I'll just suggest as well that if there are alternative design treatments that y'all have seen before that y'all would like us to entertain, obviously there's different paving treatments that can also be used on the sidewalk in the pedestrian realm. The nodes at the corners, as you saw in the graphics last month, could show it, or there could be small plaza spaces that have some differently colored paving treatments and such. We went with the crosswalk as the place to highlight based on two things. One, assuming some financial constraints on how much we beautify, and two, you have both the aesthetic benefit here and it's the additional safety benefit for those folks who don't normally think about crosswalks and stop bars and safe passage and that sort of thing. It's just one more reminder that this is a safe and should be a safe and open corridor for pedestrians. You ready to move on, Josh?
I think so. So street furniture, we presented 5 options, I believe it was, last time. Got a lot of good feedback. And so we've kind of taken that and kind of boiled it down to these 3 that we will be moving forward. So the first one is pretty similar to one we showed before. It's the graceful and muted. So again, real, sweeping lines, that muted tone. We had lighting before in these kit of parts, and we took that out and replaced it with a bus transit shelter, just to kind of complete this kit of street furniture and kind of leave lighting as a separate kind of discussion element. So this is the first kit of part, that graceful and muted. The second one, before we had this and it was black. This is the traditional and rounded. And this was a black tone before. We had some comments about, the black absorbing a lot of heat and it being a potential issue. So we kind of switched that out for this green verdigris color that kind of ties into some of the existing street furniture and light poles that are in the downtown area. And then the last one being right, the warm and utilitarian. So again, replacing that lighting with a bus shelter type. Not saying that this is the specific shelter, but it's just kind of in that same family, kind of has that same language. And so these are the three that we will be moving forward with as options.
Thank you, Josh.
Yep.
I'll
Looks like
also
we've got a-
encourage folks to think about this and think about the lighting options as a suite, right? So
That's right.
we would like to hear some further direction if you have such in regards to these things. We will be rendering this images of this project, and at some point we'll just have to pick something to insert. So if that was based on some modicum of agreement among yourselves, that would be great. But so think about how these suites of furnishings could potentially relate to those lighting options that were shown by Jeff earlier.
Hey, Derek, it looks like we've got a question from Matthew in the chat. Are you saying these treatments are dependent upon local funding? I would love to have green lanes and bike lane markings in intersections. We don't have that anywhere else in Lafayette. If DOTD doesn't pay for it, I doubt it will happen.
I may have missed something that you guys had said, but it sounded like Jeff was saying that these intersection treatments, he may have been just talking about the bricks, but I wasn't sure if he was talking about the striping, if that would be part of the project funding, or if that's going to be another one of those optional things that is subject to local funding.
And Matthew, there may be others who know more than I on the call who are welcome to chime in, but I just don't think we know at this point. Obviously, those serve transportation functions. They serve safety functions. The federal government's embrace of the green paint is subject to local permissions, and Lafayette has obtained that permission. But it's not typically an FHWA funded enhancement. That being said, things are changing all the time, and the complete streets focus at all levels of government is very strong and getting stronger. Would get stronger still with the pending federal legislation. So I just don't think we know yet. It's a fine question and one that we need to answer for the project and for y'all. Remember that what we're trying to do here is essentially refine the options well enough so that we have a pretty well defined project that goes into the environmental impact statement that we would then take to the rest of the community and not just yourselves, right? There's going to be public meetings coming up this year. There will be a draft EIS that talks about all of these things and the details therein. We're trying to work with y'all to define what that project is going into that. For example, signals or roundabouts, those sorts of things, as you had mentioned earlier. And some of it still will not be defined. There will be additional work through the EIS process to clarify things. And then once we get federal approval to complete design, we'll enter into the design phase, which is really where things like RFB, Hawk signal warrants would be completed and assessed. And some of these other things would be costed out in greater detail.
Derek, it looks like Matthew has a follow-up.
Yeah, I typed it in the chat, but the reason I keep asking about, I'm sure y'all are annoyed with me by now, but the reason I keep asking about, whether this is going to come from project funding or whether it's going to come from local funding is I feel like we're being presented a suite of choices here, but without knowing whether those choices are feasible from a budget standpoint, like it makes it really hard for me to feel like this process is useful, or that it's going to lead to any of the stuff that you guys are presenting actually happening. So I'm kind of just wondering, like, why all these designs were like, why you guys have put all these designs up if it's still a question of whether or not any of this will actually get funded.
Matthew, it's Jeff Grobe. Let me answer that at least a little bit.
Sure.
I think what we're trying to do is offer you the realm of feasible possibilities. Now, that requires you to prioritize what is most important, if any of this stuff is important to you, and then you got to go advocate for it. Because if it becomes local funding issue, you've got, people in town, you have to gather some support for it and go get the money, or at least bother people enough so that it becomes important to them because it's important to you. But if we don't present the alternatives, then there's no discussion of what else is possible to enhance this project such that it becomes the best that it can be.
Monique has added a wonderful reflection as well in the chat. She may want to speak to that. I would just like to point to the structures work from largely last year and some early this year as an example of how the process is sort of intended to work. So we're pretty early on in defining what this thing is. I know it doesn't seem like that, but for example, it wasn't that long ago we were asking y'all, what kind of bridge should it be? What should the structure type be? Would a signature be important? Where would that go? And now we can say we're doing a segmental box structure. There will be a signature feature near Jefferson. There will be pylon gateways at Willow and the South Gateway. And we've defined some other wall and column types. So, and with that, came a significant and quantifiable commitment about what DOTD was going to pay for. So I realize that it can be a slow process, but we are getting there, and more clarity is gained all the time.
Matthew, let me respond to what you just wrote. It's not an either or. We would not sacrifice bike and ped safety for something else. That's not going to happen. Bike and ped safety is obviously number one, and it's non-negotiable. The question is are any of the things that we're presenting over the last few of these workshops important enough to the community? We say, that's something that I think we should have. And that's a discussion that you have to have amongst yourselves. We only put it out there to identify the issues for y'all to discuss. I can't give you the answer. I can only give you the realm of possibilities. But saying that bike and ped safety, it's either bike and ped safety or nice light poles it's not a question. That doesn't even enter into the discussion.
So Jeff, let me clarify that though. Like, do you guys admit that signalized crosswalks, these hawk signals at roundabouts, will make them safer for pedestrians?
I'm not the expert on that one. I would defer.
So but if that's the case, and that's something that's not part of the project budget or won't be included in the project budget, then it goes into this optional bucket, which is where all of these lampposts and street furnitures and signature bridge stuff goes. And so ultimately someone will make a decision that says, well, we only have this pool of money to spend on this project, and we're going to spend some of it here and some of it there. I'm just worried that some things will get cut in favor of a pretty welcoming corridor that will be ultimately unsafe for the people that aren't in cars that occupy it.
Right. No, I understand.
Jeff.
Joe, go ahead.
Hey, so one statement I want to make is just from a project standpoint, we never want to sacrifice safety for aesthetics. But in regards to your question about these hawk signals at these roundabouts, that is something that DOTD is strongly considering right now. And, there is some research that suggests that multi-lane roundabouts are a little bit more difficult to cross for pedestrians than single lane roundabouts. And that's part of the reason why DOTD is considering the addition of those types of signals at pedestrian crossings. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, there's definitely research that says multi-lane roundabouts are what, 2 to 3 times, what I have is 2 to 3 times more likely to have a motorist fail to yield to a pedestrian and a multi-lane versus single lane. So all of these roundabouts are multi-lane. I am very concerned, especially in light of the increase in pedestrian and bicyclist deaths that we've had in our community here and nationwide. Like, we need to be taking this seriously. So I'm just going to keep harping on that. And
Well, we absolutely do.
when the question of whether these improvements will be funded, because I'm sure this isn't something that the FHWA requires or that it's in DOTD guidelines to have these hawk signals. So that when you guys say that to me, it becomes one of those optional things that comes down to local funding and, you know, comes down to discretion. And I guess I don't have enough faith in the political process here in Lafayette to think that that discretion will be used to favor the safety of pedestrians and cyclists over some other goals.
Matthew, I would say that when it comes to safety, DOTD is not gonna construct a project that they don't consider to be safe. Okay, and what that means is they would be willing to fund the project elements that would contribute to the safety of the project that they're trying to construct. So it's not an option. This is something that, you know, it, like you said, it has some bearing. There is research that has evidence that multi-lane roundabouts have a lower safety rating for pedestrian crossings than single lane roundabouts. With that in mind, we still have to make sure that we are accommodating the traffic that's been projected to be out there whenever we build this project. And what that means is we can't go down to a single lane roundabout. So with that in mind, we will have to make sure that we are providing a safe facility for all of the road users.
Do you guys know what percentage of the throughways current traffic is throughput, people like from passing through the city of Lafayette as opposed to neighborhood, like localized traffic? Because I'm wondering if it really warrants the number of lanes that we have on this boulevard. And Sarah Gary, who is a couple times asked to be unmuted here, has told me before that it's mostly traffic coming through the city and not traffic in the neighborhood. So if that's the case, do we really need these big, wide, multi-lane roundabouts here, or can we pare down the level of traffic on these roads? I'm worried that we're like creating induced demand here that's just going to end up being dangerous for the neighborhood that it is in, you know?
You know, this is Scott Hoppe. I'm one of the planners representing TASK, the program manager of this. With regard to operational issues like that, we will be talking about that later on, providing all the details behind the studies that have been completed already. But like Joe said, the Department of Transportation will not be providing an overly overcapacity type of a greater than needed sized facility, and they will not provide an undersized facility either. So rest assured that we've completed the analysis and it's sized accordingly. But these types of details, these operational details, and lots of more information will be presented later on down the line. Right now, the focus, as we've been talking about, is more along the lines of if we were to have a type of crosswalk, what would it look like? So that's where we wanted to focus our time in these meetings. And but suffice to say, the design that you're seeing is the design that the department has reviewed and approved.
I do want to give, Sarah, you've been unmuted. I do want to give you, if we can take your comment
Yeah, thanks,
quickly.
Jennifer. And just to clear it up for everybody, I only asked to be unmuted once and Jennifer did it right away. So thank you. But I do want to speak to the safety issue. Yes. Have we had a lot of pedestrian and bicycle fatalities on the thruway? Yes, we have. But what people need to understand is that right now the thruway is getting 3,300 cars an hour. Once the elevated structure is built, okay, and this is the important thing, is that it's going to lift the interstate traffic off of the thruway and turn the thruway back into a local street. However, it does still have the traffic volumes that is going to be needed to necessitate the type of roadway that you have been presenting. The second thing is if we have a series of roundabouts, which are proven safety countermeasures, it will slow the traffic down enough to give pedestrians a chance to cross safely. Now, what we cannot predict, and what I have said millions of times, anybody has heard me say this, is that we cannot predict human nature. So we can build the best pedestrian and bicycle facilities out there, but we cannot force people to use them and or cross in the right spaces. And a lot of the pedestrian fatalities and bicycle fatalities that we are seeing on the thruway right now is because people are not crossing at the intersections, they are crossing mid-block, which unfortunately, then people don't see them because they're not crossing in the right places. So if we can make this, the roundabouts will slow everything down. We will do whatever is necessary as far as pedestrian and bike safety. We should have a much safer thruway. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That's good clarification. We're gonna try and just move it ahead a little bit, just to stay on topic, but I'll let Derek follow up from here.
And I'm going to alley-oop that to Scott because I do believe we are at the end.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the LCP and DOTD, we want to thank everyone for joining today for the first of two sessions for the last workshop. The next steps would be to take all the information that was presented here, will be uploaded, review it, share it, meet on it, and prepare for our next Thursday's meeting when we'd love to hear from everyone on all of these topics. And again, we're not finished here. We really need some input on these topics that were presented today. Questions, if you have them, bring them to that meeting and we'll follow up. Like we said, Jennifer, the material should be available beginning tomorrow, right, Jennifer?
That's right. Yes, it takes a little while to download everything, but we'll have those up for you tomorrow and encourage people to share with your various coteries and constituents and come back with some feedback for us at next Thursday's meeting.
Right. And there were some questions that were posed to you today. Try to remember those and think about them. And to Matthew's point earlier, these are discussion points, but it's going to be a larger discussion than just here with regard to what's going to happen underneath the structure, what's going to be paid for by whom. And this is going to be a continuing dialogue, and it's really ramping up here. And I encourage everyone to continue to stay involved even after this coming Thursday's session, and through neighborhood meetings and public meetings, stuff like that. And we'll talk about that next week more. But if there's not any other specific question, I guess we'll wrap it up for the day. Thanks much for everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you back here next Thursday.
All right, take care.